The Galactic Council's emergency session had been in progress for 6 standard rotations, and Admiral Zefkar could feel the weight of 1,000 civilizations bearing down on his exoskeleton. The massive amphitheater, carved from a single asteroid and capable of holding representatives from every known sapient species, buzzed with the desperate energy of beings facing extinction. The quantum cascade failure has spread to 17 more systems, announced Dr. Valandra, the Crystalline Collective's foremost physicist. Her translucent form flickered with distressed patterns of light. At this rate, we estimate complete galactic infrastructure collapse within 47 standard cycles. A wave of panic swept through the assembled delegates. The hive mind of Epsilon Prime released a collective shriek that made the universal translators stutter. The gas-based nebula wanderers shifted their containment fields nervously, while the silicon-based builders clicked their mandibles in agitation. Admiral Zefkar raised his primary arm for silence. As the military commander of the largest Alliance fleet in known space, his word carried considerable weight. Honored delegates, we have heard the reports. The situation is critical, but not hopeless. Dr. Valandra, please explain the nature of the crisis for those who may not fully understand the technical aspects. The crystalline being's form brightened as she accessed her data cores. The quantum cascade began 3 cycles ago in the Meridian sector. What appeared to be a routine hyperspace gateway malfunction has revealed itself to be something far more catastrophic. The failure created a resonance effect that is spreading through the quantum substrate that underlies all our faster-than-light technologies. She gestured, and a 3-dimensional holographic display materialized in the center of the amphitheater. It showed the galaxy as a web of interconnected lines, representing the quantum pathways that enabled instant communication and travel across impossible distances. Large sections of the web were already dark, severed from the network. Every hyperspace jump, every quantum communicator activation, every piece of technology that manipulates spacetime is accelerating the cascade. The more we use these technologies to coordinate our response, the faster the problem spreads. We are literally destroying our ability to solve the crisis by trying to solve it. Chancellor Mordak of the Hegemony Worlds leaned forward, his reptilian features twisted with concern. What about the research teams? Surely our greatest minds working together can find a solution. That's precisely the problem, Doctor, Valandra replied, her light patterns dimming to indicate frustration. We've assembled teams from 43 different species, representing the pinnacle of galactic scientific achievement. They've been working around the clock using quantum-enhanced supercomputers that can process calculations beyond the comprehension of any single organic mind. The display shifted, showing vast research facilities across multiple worlds. Beings in environmental suits worked frantically around massive computational arrays, their forms dwarfed by the scale of the technology surrounding them. The Ethereal Collective has devoted their entire psionic network to the problem. The machine intelligence of Sector 7 has allocated 97% of their processing power. The Unified Mathematics Consortium has been running continuous calculations using resources that could power entire star systems. How much has been spent on this effort? Asked Senator Krechak, her insectoid mandibles clicking nervously. Dr. Valandra's form flickered as she accessed financial records. Conservative estimates place the cost at 847 million galactic standard credits. That includes computational time, research materials, facility construction, and the deployment of our most advanced scientific equipment across 17 different research sites. The number hit the assembly like a physical blow. Several delegates made sounds of distress in their native languages, while others simply sat in stunned silence. And what results have we achieved for this investment? Admiral Zefkar asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. The cascade has continued to accelerate. Every solution we've attempted has either failed completely or made the situation worse. Our most recent attempt to create a quantum stabilization field actually caused the failure to jump 3 sectors forward, consuming the Balarian trade route entirely. The holographic display updated, showing how their intervention had backfired spectacularly. Where once there had been a thriving network of commercial hyperspace lanes, now there was nothing but dark space, cut off from the rest of galactic civilization. We've reached an impasse. Doctor, Valandra continued, our models suggest that conventional approaches are fundamentally insufficient. The mathematics involved require computational resources we simply don't possess, even with our combined technological capabilities. From the observer's gallery, a small voice spoke up. Have you considered asking the humans? The entire amphitheater fell silent. Thousands of eyes, optical sensors, and other sensory organs turned toward the source of the comment. In a section reserved for minor species representatives sat Ambassador Sarah Chen, the sole human present at the emergency session. Chancellor Mordak's expression was one of barely concealed disdain. The humans? Delegate Chen, with all due respect to your species, this is a crisis that has stumped our greatest minds. The humans have barely achieved interstellar travel. Their technology is primitive compared to the civilizations represented here. Sarah Chen stood slowly, her slight frame seeming insignificant among the towering aliens surrounding her. Chancellor, I understand your skepticism. Humans have only been part of the galactic community for 18 standard cycles. But sometimes an outside perspective can be valuable. An outside perspective? The hive mind of Epsilon Prime spoke through their designated voice drone. Young species, we have perspectives from 43 different evolutionary paths, representing billions of years of combined scientific development. What could your mammals possibly contribute? Admiral Zefkar noticed something in the human's expression that made him pause. There was no defensiveness, no wounded pride. Instead, there was a quiet confidence that seemed oddly out of place given the circumstances. Ambassador Chen, he said carefully, are you suggesting that humanity might have insights that our assembled experts have missed? I'm suggesting that human problem-solving approaches might be different, she replied. We tend to think about problems in ways that other species sometimes find illogical or inefficient. Dr. Valandra's crystalline form pulsed with what might have been amusement. Different how? Our computational models have explored millions of potential solutions. We've examined the problem from every conceivable angle using the most sophisticated analytical tools in the galaxy. Sarah Chen was quiet for a moment, appearing to consider her words carefully. May I ask what approaches you've tried? Standard quantum field manipulation, multidimensional matrix calculations, temporal loop analysis, consciousness-driven reality alteration, probability cascade mapping. Dr. Valandra rattled off a list of techniques that would have been incomprehensible to most beings. We've employed every advanced scientific methodology known to galactic civilization. All very sophisticated, Sarah agreed. But have you tried turning it off and turning it back on again? The silence that followed was deafening. Several delegates exchanged glances that clearly conveyed their opinion of human intelligence. Chancellor Mordak made a sound that the universal translator rendered as dismissive laughter. Delegate Chen, he said, his tone now openly condescending. We are dealing with a quantum cascade failure that threatens the fundamental structure of space-time itself. This is not some primitive electrical device that can be reset by cycling power. Of course not, Sarah replied evenly. I was being deliberately simplistic to make a point. Humans approach complex problems differently than most species. We have a tendency to look for simple solutions first before moving to more complex ones. Simple solutions, the machine intelligence's representative, a gleaming chrome android, spoke with perfect digital precision. This crisis requires computational complexity beyond your species' comprehension. Simple solutions are inadequate, Sarah Chen smiled, and Admiral Zefkar found himself intrigued by the expression.
It wasn't the smile of someone who felt insulted or dismissed.
It was the smile of someone who knew something the others didn't. Perhaps, she said. But would you be willing to let a human take a look at the problem? What's the worst that could happen? The worst that could happen, Dr. Devkal, Velandra said, her light patterns now clearly indicating exasperation, is that we waste valuable time while the cascade continues to spread. Every moment we delay, more systems are lost. How much time would you need? Admiral Zefkar asked, surprising himself. Something about the human's quiet confidence was compelling. Sarah Chen checked the chronometer on her wrist, a primitive mechanical device that seemed laughably obsolete in the high-tech environment of the council chambers. Give me an hour. The reaction was immediate and intense. Delegates erupted in sounds of disbelief, outrage, and what might charitably be called laughter. The hive mind of Epsilon Prime's collective shriek was so loud that several species had to activate auditory protection. An hour? Chancellor Mordak's voice rose an octave. Our teams have been working for cycles with no results, and you think you can solve it in an hour? I think it's worth trying, Sarah replied calmly. An hour is nothing compared to the cycles you've already spent, and if I fail, you'll only have lost 1 hour. Doctor. Valandra's crystalline form was now flashing rapidly, indicating extreme agitation. This is absurd. The mathematical complexity alone would require... May I suggest a compromise? Admiral Zefkar interrupted. The veteran commander had learned to trust his instincts over the years. And something about this situation felt significant. We allow Ambassador Chen to examine the problem while our teams continue their work. If she discovers something useful, we benefit. If not, we lose only the time she requested. The debate that followed was heated and prolonged. Species after species voiced their objections, citing the primitive nature of human technology, the insult to their greatest scientific minds, and the waste of precious time. But Admiral Zefkar's influence carried weight, and eventually, a reluctant consensus was reached. Very well, Chancellor Mordak said with obvious reluctance. Ambassador Chen, you will be given access to our data and 1 hour to examine the problem. But I want it clearly stated that this is being done against the recommendations of our scientific advisors. Sarah Chen nodded graciously. Understood, Chancellor. Dr. Valandra, could you provide me with the basic parameters of the cascade failure? Nothing too complex initially, just the fundamental mechanics. The crystalline physicist's form dimmed to what Admiral Zefkar recognized as resignation. The cascade began when a hyperspace gateway in the Meridian sector experienced a quantum field inversion. Instead of creating a stable wormhole, the gateway created a null space bubble that began consuming the quantum substrate that supports faster-than-light technologies. She gestured, and the holographic display focused on a specific region of space. The bubble expands each time someone attempts to use quantum-based technology within a certain proximity. The more energy applied, the faster it grows. Our attempts to contain or reverse it have only accelerated the process. Sarah Chen studied the display for several minutes, occasionally asking simple questions about the timeline and the specific technologies affected. Her queries seemed almost childishly basic compared to the sophisticated analyses being conducted by the various research teams. So every time someone uses hyperspace travel or quantum communication near the affected area, the problem gets worse? She asked. Precisely. It's a self-perpetuating cascade that feeds on the very technologies we depend upon for our civilization. And your teams have been using these technologies to coordinate their research? Dr. Valandra paused, her crystalline form flickering uncertainly. Well, yes. It's impossible to conduct large-scale research without quantum-enhanced computers and faster-than-light communication networks. Sarah Chen nodded thoughtfully. I see. And every time you run a simulation or test a potential solution, you're potentially making the problem worse. The energy requirements for our research are negligible compared to commercial and military applications, Dr. Valandra protested. The effect on the cascade is minimal. Minimal but not zero? Well, no. Not zero. Admiral Zefkar watched the exchange with growing interest. The human wasn't asking about complex mathematical formulas or exotic physics. She was asking about basic cause and effect, about the practical realities of how they were approaching the problem. One more question, Sarah said. Has anyone tried simply stopping? Stopping what? All of it. All quantum-based technology use in and around the affected areas. Complete technological silence. Dr. Carl. Valandra's form went completely still, the crystalline equivalent of stunned silence. That would be impossible. Our entire civilization depends on these technologies. Commerce, communication, transportation, research, everything would cease to function. For how long? I don't understand the question. Sarah Chen's smile returned, and Admiral Zefkar realized he was witnessing something significant. The human had identified something that thousands of the galaxy's greatest minds had missed. How long would you need to maintain technological silence to see if the cascade stabilizes or begins to reverse? The question hung in the air like a physical presence. Dr. Valandra began running rapid calculations, her form flashing with complex light patterns. Other delegates leaned forward, suddenly realizing that the primitive human might have stumbled onto something profound. According to our models, Dr. Valandra said slowly, if all quantum-based technology use ceased within a 10-sector radius of the cascade, we might see stabilization within 6 to 12 standard rotations. The implications hit the assembly like a thunderbolt. The solution wasn't about building bigger computers or developing more sophisticated theories. It was about having the discipline to stop feeding the problem. But that's impossible, Chancellor Mordak protested. We can't simply shut down galactic civilization. The economic disruption alone would be catastrophic. More catastrophic than losing faster-than-light travel permanently? Sarah Chen asked quietly. Admiral Zefkar stood slowly, his ancient exoskeleton creaking with the movement. Ambassador Chen, are you suggesting that the solution to our crisis is to temporarily abandon the very technologies that define our civilization? I'm suggesting that sometimes the best way to solve a problem is to stop making it worse, she replied. You've spent millions of credits and cycles trying to fight the cascade with the same technologies that created it. Maybe the answer isn't to use those technologies better. Maybe the answer is to stop using them until the system can heal itself. The human had been in the chamber for less than 30 minutes, and she had already identified a potential solution that had eluded the combined scientific might of the galaxy. The realization was both humbling and terrifying. As the delegates began to grasp the implications of what the human was proposing, Admiral Zefker found himself wondering what other simple solutions his species might have overlooked in their rush to apply sophisticated technology to every problem they encountered. The hour wasn't up yet, but Sarah Chen had already accomplished something remarkable. She had reminded an entire galaxy that sometimes the most complex problems had the simplest solutions, and that wisdom didn't always correlate with technological advancement. The question now was whether the galactic community would have the courage to follow through on a solution that required them to temporarily become less than they were in order to survive. The Galactic Council chamber had transformed from a place of desperate deliberation into something resembling a war room. Admiral Zevkar watched as delegates huddled in species-specific groups, their conversations ranging from heated arguments to whispered consultations with home governments. The human's simple proposal had shattered the consensus that had driven their response for 3 cycles, replacing certainty with doubt and sophisticated solutions with an almost insulting simplicity. Sarah Chen remained in her observer seat, apparently unbothered by the chaos her suggestion had created. She was reading something on a primitive paper-based notebook, occasionally making marks with an ancient writing implement called a pen. The sight of such outdated technology in the council chamber would have been amusing under other circumstances. The economic models are catastrophic, Senator Kreethak announced as she returned from consultation with her advisors. Her insectoid features were drawn with stress. Our preliminary calculations suggest that a complete cessation of quantum-based technologies would cost the galactic economy approximately 2.3 trillion credits per standard rotation.
That assumes the cascade doesn't continue spreading, Dr. Ray,
Velandra pointed out, her crystalline form still flickering with the rapid calculations she'd been running since the human's proposal.
If we lose all faster-than-light capability permanently, the economic disruption would be
incalculable. Chancellor Mordak stood at the center of the chamber, his reptilian features drawn into an expression of deep concentration. Even if we accept the human's premise that technological cessation might halt the cascade, the practical challenges are enormous. How do we coordinate a galaxy-wide shutdown without using the very communication systems we're proposing to disable? Admiral Zefkar had been considering the same question. The irony wasn't lost on him that implementing the human solution would require the largest coordinated effort in galactic history, yet it couldn't use any of the technologies that normally made such coordination possible. If I may, Sarah Chen said, closing her notebook and standing. The coordination problem isn't as complex as it seems. All eyes turned to her once again. The human seemed remarkably composed for someone whose species was considered barely civilized by galactic standards. You're thinking like a galactic civilization, she continued. You're trying to coordinate trillions of beings across thousands of worlds simultaneously, but that's not necessary. Of course it's necessary, the machine intelligence representative interjected. Partial compliance would be insufficient. If even a small percentage of systems continue using quantum technologies, the cascade will continue. Sarah Chen shook her head. You only need to stop the cascade from spreading further while it stabilizes. That means you can shut down systems in phases, starting with those closest to the cascade and working outward. She moved to the holographic display and gestured at the affected regions. Look at the pattern. The cascade spreads along existing quantum pathways, following the routes of heaviest technological use. You don't need to shut down the entire galaxy at once. You just need to create a buffer zone of technological silence around the cascade. Then expand that zone systematically. Dr. Velandra's form brightened as she processed the implications. A quarantine approach, starting with the most affected sectors and expanding outward as needed. It would still require massive coordination, but on a manageable scale. Exactly, Sarah agreed. And you coordinate it using slower-than-light communication methods. Radio waves, laser communications, even physical message delivery if necessary. Humans did it for centuries before we developed quantum communication. The suggestion was met with the alien equivalent of gasps and horrified expressions. The idea of reverting to primitive communication methods was apparently more shocking than the prospect of economic collapse. Laser communication? The ethereal collective's representative, a being of pure energy contained within a sophisticated field generator, pulsed with what might have been disbelief. Do you understand how long it would take to coordinate anything across interstellar distances using light-speed communication?
Years, Sarah admitted cheerfully.
But you don't need instant coordination for this plan. You need systematic, methodical implementation. Each sector shuts down based on a predetermined schedule, not on real-time commands. Admiral Zefkar found himself impressed despite his initial skepticism. The human was proposing to solve a crisis caused by the galaxy's dependence on instantaneous everything by deliberately embracing slowness and patience. Let me understand this correctly, he said, his voice carrying across the chamber. You're suggesting that we create a detailed shutdown schedule in advance, distribute it through conventional means, and then implement it sector by sector without central coordination?
That's part of it, Sarah confirmed.
But there's more. While you're implementing the technological silence, you also need to prepare for what comes next. What comes next? Chancellor Mordak asked, his tone suggesting he wasn't sure he wanted to know. Recovery and reconstruction. Once the cascade stabilizes, you'll need to rebuild your quantum infrastructure from scratch. But this time, you'll need to design it with safeguards to prevent another cascade failure. The implications of that statement sent a new wave of dismay through the assembly. Not only would they need to temporarily abandon their advanced technology, they would need to completely redesign it afterward. The cost, Senator Krefak began, but Sarah Chen interrupted her. Will be far less than the cost of permanent technological collapse, she said firmly. And there's something else to consider. This crisis might actually be an opportunity. An opportunity? The hive mind of Epsilon Prime's collective voice rose to nearly painful levels. Our entire civilization is facing extinction, and you call it an opportunity? Sarah Chen's expression became more serious, and Admiral Zefkar noticed that her seemingly casual demeanor had been masking a sharp intelligence that was now becoming apparent. How long has the galactic community been using quantum-based technologies? She asked. Approximately 4,000 standard cycles, Dr. Valandra replied automatically. And in all that time, has there ever been a comprehensive review of the fundamental principles underlying those technologies? The crystalline physicist's form dimmed as she considered the question. The basic principles were established by the ancients. We've built upon their work, refined it, made it more efficient, but the core theory has remained unchanged. Because it worked, Chancellor Mordak added defensively. Why question something that has served us well for millennia? Because, Sarah said quietly, something that has worked for millennia just failed catastrophically, and your best minds can't figure out why. The truth of that statement hit the assembly like a physical blow. Despite all their advanced technology and accumulated knowledge, they were facing a problem they couldn't solve using conventional methods. What are you suggesting? Admiral Zefkar asked. I'm suggesting that while you're implementing the technological shutdown, you also conduct a fundamental review of quantum theory itself. Strip it back to basics, question every assumption, and rebuild from the ground up. That would take centuries. Doctor, Vilandra protested. It would take as long as it takes, Sarah replied. But consider the alternative. You can spend centuries rebuilding your technology on a foundation you understand completely, or you can patch the current system and hope this never happens again. The chamber fell silent as delegates contemplated the magnitude of what the human was proposing. Not just a temporary return to primitive technology, but a complete reimagining of the scientific principles that had defined galactic civilization for 4,000 years. There's precedent for this approach, Sarah continued, seeming to sense their hesitation.
Human history is full of examples where apparent disasters forced us to completely rethink our approach to problems, leading to breakthroughs that wouldn't have occurred otherwise. Such as?
Admiral Zefkar found himself genuinely curious about human history, something he'd never considered relevant before. The development of our quantum theories, ironically, Sarah said with a slight smile. In the early 21st century, we experienced what we called the replication crisis in our sciences. Many of our most trusted theories turned out to be based on flawed experiments or incorrect assumptions. It was devastating to our scientific community. She moved closer to the holographic display, her small form dwarfed by the technological marvel surrounding her. But instead of trying to patch the broken theories, some of our scientists decided to start over completely. They went back to the most basic questions. What is reality? How do we know what we know? What assumptions are we making that might be wrong? And this led to breakthroughs? Dr. Darvish, Valandra asked. her crystalline form showing genuine interest for the first time. It led to the theoretical framework that eventually allowed us to develop our own quantum technologies, Sarah confirmed. Not as advanced as yours, obviously, but derived from first principles rather than inherited wisdom. Admiral Zefkar was beginning to understand why the human simple questions had been so effective. She wasn't approaching the problem with the accumulated biases of millennia of technological development. She was thinking like someone encountering the problem for the first time. But even if we accept your proposal, Chancellor Mordak said, the practical challenges remain enormous. How do we convince entire civilizations to voluntarily abandon the technologies that define their way of life? The same way you convince them to allocate millions of credits to research teams that haven't produced results, Sarah replied. You explain the alternatives and let them make an informed choice. She gestured at the holographic display showing the spreading cascade. Right now, they're watching their technological infrastructure disappear whether they wanted to or not. At least this way, they get to participate in the decision and know that it's temporary. Assuming it works, the machine intelligence representative added ominously. Assuming it works, Sarah agreed. But consider the risk-benefit analysis. If you continue with current approaches, you have a very low probability of success and a very high probability of total technological collapse. If you try my approach, you have a reasonable probability of success and the same high probability of collapse if it fails. The downside is the same, but the upside is much better. Admiral Zefkar found her logic compelling, but he could see that many delegates remained skeptical. The idea of voluntarily abandoning advanced technology went against everything their civilizations valued. There's another factor to consider, Dr. Valandra said slowly. If we implement Ambassador Chen's proposal and it fails, we'll have lost the time needed to pursue other solutions. The cascade will continue spreading during the shutdown period, potentially making the situation irreversible. That's true, Sarah acknowledged. But how much progress have you made with other solutions in the past 3 cycles? The uncomfortable silence that followed answered her question more effectively than any words could have. Look, Sarah said, her tone becoming more urgent. I understand that what I'm proposing sounds crazy from your perspective, but sometimes crazy is exactly what you need when conventional wisdom has failed. She moved to stand directly in front of the central holographic display, her small human form now the focus of attention from thousands of alien beings. You've spent millions of credits and engaged the greatest minds in the galaxy, and you're further from a solution now than when you started. The cascade is accelerating, not slowing. Every day you delay trying something different is another day closer to total civilizational collapse. And if we're wrong about the human approach? Chancellor Mordak asked. Sarah Chen's expression became very serious. Then you'll face the same catastrophic collapse you're facing now, but you'll do it knowing you tried everything possible. Right now, you're facing that collapse knowing you were too proud to try the simple solution. Admiral Zefkar realized that the human had maneuvered them into a position where her proposal was the only rational choice, despite its apparent irrationality. She had demonstrated that conventional approaches had failed, identified the logical flaws in their current strategy, and presented an alternative that, while radical, offered better prospects than continuing on their current path. The question was no longer whether her solution might work, but whether the galactic community had the courage to implement it. And as Admiral Zefkar looked around the chamber at the desperate faces of beings from 1,000 different worlds, he began to believe they might just be desperate enough to try. The clock was ticking, and Sarah Chen's hour wasn't even half over. The atmosphere in the council chamber had shifted from desperate panic to something Admiral Zefkar recognized from his military career. The tense anticipation that preceded a critical battle. Sarah Chen had presented her solution, but now came the far more challenging task of implementing it across a galaxy that had never attempted anything like it before. Before we proceed with any decision, Chancellor Mordak announced, I want to hear from our technical teams about the feasibility of Ambassador Chen's proposal. He gestured toward Dr. Khan. Velandra, can you provide us with a realistic assessment of what would be required? The crystalline physicist's form had been flickering rapidly for several minutes as she ran calculations through her quantum-enhanced cognitive matrix. The mathematical models are, actually, quite encouraging, she admitted reluctantly. If we could achieve complete quantum technology cessation within a 10-sector radius of the cascade, our simulations show a 73.6% probability of cascade stabilization within 12 standard rotations. A wave of murmurs swept through the assembly. After cycles of hearing nothing but increasingly grim projections, any positive probability felt like a miracle. However, Dr. Valendra continued, and the chamber fell silent again. The logistical challenges are unprecedented. We would need to coordinate the shutdown of approximately 2.7 million quantum communication nodes, 450,000 hyperspace gateways, and countless millions of smaller quantum-enhanced devices across 47 different star systems, each containing multiple species with different technological dependencies and governmental structures, added Senator Krethak. Some of these civilizations have never cooperated on anything, let alone a coordinated technological shutdown. Admiral Zefkar watched Sarah Chen as the experts outlined the obstacles to her proposal. The human seemed unfazed by the scale of the challenge, which either indicated remarkable confidence or a fundamental misunderstanding of the complexity involved.
Ambassador Chen, he said, you've heard the technical assessment.
Do you still believe your approach is viable given these constraints? Sarah closed her notebook and stood, moving to the central display area where she could address the entire assembly. Admiral, with respect, you're thinking about this backwards. How so? You're trying to figure out how to coordinate millions of devices and dozens of governments from the top down. But that's not how you solve a crisis of this scale. You solve it from the bottom up. The machine intelligence representative's chrome features shifted into what might have been confusion. Please clarify. Centralized coordination is the most efficient method for large-scale operations. Efficient, yes, but not necessarily effective, Sarah replied. And definitely not resilient. When you centralize coordination, you create single points of failure. What happens if your central command structure is affected by the cascade? Dr. Velandra's form dimmed as she processed the implications. We hadn't considered that scenario. Right now, you're running your crisis coordination through quantum communication networks that are potentially vulnerable to the very problem you're trying to solve. That's like trying to repair a building's foundation from the top floor. Sarah Chen moved closer to the holographic display, her small form somehow commanding attention from beings who dwarfed her physically and technologically. Instead of trying to control the shutdown from a central location, you need to make each system, each world, each individual responsible for their part of the solution. You give them the information they need, the timeline they need to follow, and the authority to act independently. That would be chaos, Chancellor Mordok protested. Without central coordination, there's no guarantee that systems would shut down in the proper sequence or at the correct times. There's also no guarantee that central coordination would work better, Sarah countered. But there is a guarantee that distributed implementation is more resilient to unexpected problems. She gestured at the display showing the cascade's spread pattern. Look at how the cascade itself is behaving. It's not following centralized commands. It's spreading according to simple rules. Find quantum activity, consume it, grow. It's a distributed system, and you're trying to fight it with centralized thinking. Admiral Zefkar found himself nodding despite his instinctive preference for military hierarchy and centralized command. The human's point about resilience resonated with his experience in combat, where rigid command structures often collapsed under the chaos of battle. What exactly are you proposing? He asked. Distributed autonomy with simple rules, Sarah replied immediately. Every system gets a shutdown schedule based on their distance from the cascade. Every government gets the authority to implement local variations as needed. Every world gets the responsibility to monitor their own compliance and report status through slower-than-light communication. But how do we ensure compliance without real-time monitoring? Senator Krethak's mandibles clicked nervously. You don't, Sarah said simply. You make compliance obviously in everyone's self-interest. The statement sent another wave of confused murmurs through the assembly. The idea of not monitoring compliance was apparently as alien to the galactic community as the idea of abandoning quantum technology. Explain, Admiral Zefkar commanded. Sarah Chen's expression became more serious. Right now, every system in the galaxy is watching the cascade spread toward them. They know that if it reaches them, they'll lose their quantum technology permanently. If you can show them that temporary voluntary shutdown will prevent permanent involuntary shutdown, most will comply without coercion. Most, but not all? Dr. Velandra pointed out. True. There will always be some who don't comply, either from selfishness, stupidity, or simple inability to implement the shutdown properly. But that's actually acceptable. The chamber erupted in protests. The idea that non-compliance was acceptable went against everything they understood about crisis management. Sarah raised her voice to be heard over the commotion. It's acceptable because perfect compliance isn't necessary for success. The cascade spreads along paths of highest quantum activity. If you can reduce overall quantum activity by 80 or 90%, The cascade will slow dramatically, even if some systems continue operating normally. But our models assume complete cessation, Dr. Valandra objected. Your models are probably wrong, Sarah said bluntly. They're based on theoretical perfect conditions that never exist in reality. Real solutions need to work with imperfect implementation and partial compliance. Admiral Zefkar watched Dr. Valandra's reaction with interest. The crystalline being's form flickered rapidly as she ran new calculations based on Sarah's parameters. She's not incorrect, Dr. Valandra admitted after several minutes. If we model partial compliance scenarios, yes, an 80% reduction in quantum activity would still produce cascade stabilization, though with lower probability and longer timelines. How much lower? Chancellor Mordak asked. Approximately 61% probability of stabilization within 18 standard rotations. The numbers were still better than anything they'd achieved with conventional approaches, and Sarah Chen had identified them in less than an hour of analysis.
There's something else, Sarah continued.
While you're implementing the shutdown, you'll also be gathering data about the cascade that you've never had access to before. What kind of data? Admiral Zefkar asked. Real-time observation of cascade behavior in the absence of quantum interference. Right now, every measurement you take affects the system you're trying to measure. It's like trying to study a wild animal while constantly poking it with sticks. Dr. Valandra's form brightened considerably. Observational data without quantum measurement effects that could revolutionize our understanding of the underlying physics. Exactly. You're not just buying time for the cascade to stabilize. You're creating the first quantum-free laboratory environment in galactic history. You might learn more about fundamental physics in the next year than you have in the previous 1,000. Admiral Zefkar realized that Sarah Chen had just reframed the entire crisis. Instead of being a catastrophic failure that required desperate measures, it was becoming an unprecedented research opportunity that happened to require unconventional methods. But we still haven't addressed the practical implementation challenges, Senator Krethak pointed out. Even assuming distributed coordination is possible, how do we disseminate the shutdown protocols to millions of systems without using quantum communication? The same way information spread before you had quantum communication, Sarah replied. Ship-based data transfer, laser communication networks, and good old-fashioned courier services. That would take months, the machine intelligence representative calculated.
Yes, it would.
Which is why you need to start immediately and design the implementation timeline to account for communication delays. Sarah moved to the holographic display and began manipulating it with surprising facility for someone supposedly unfamiliar with advanced technology. Look at the current spread rate of the cascade. You have approximately 15 standard rotations before it reaches the core systems. If you start information dissemination immediately, you can have shutdown protocols distributed to all affected systems within 10 rotations, giving you 5 rotations of buffer time. Assuming the cascade spread doesn't accelerate, Dr. Freud, Valandra nodded. If it accelerates beyond current projections, your existing approaches wouldn't work anyway, Sarah pointed out. At least this way you're preparing for multiple scenarios instead of hoping for the best. Admiral Zefkar found himself increasingly impressed by the human strategic thinking. She wasn't just proposing a solution, she was designing a comprehensive response plan that accounted for uncertainty and built-in resilience to unexpected problems. What about economic disruption? Chancellor Mordak asked. Even temporary shutdown will cost trillions in lost productivity. Less than permanent shutdown would cost, Sarah replied. But there's also an opportunity here. While systems are offline, they can be upgraded, maintained, and improved. Instead of treating the shutdown as dead time, treat it as scheduled maintenance on a galactic scale. Scheduled maintenance, Senator Krethak repeated thoughtfully. That actually makes sense. Most of our infrastructure is overdue for major updates. And when you bring systems back online, Sarah continued, you can do it gradually and carefully, with new safeguards to prevent future cascade failures. You're not just restoring the old system, you're building a better one. The more Admiral Zefkar listened to the humans' proposal, the more it sounded less like a desperate gamble and more like a comprehensive improvement project that happened to solve their immediate crisis as a side effect. I have one more question, he said. Why you? Why is a member of what we've considered a primitive species the one to identify a solution that escaped our greatest minds? Sarah Chen was quiet for a moment, and Admiral Zefkar thought he saw something like sadness cross her features. Because my species is still primitive, she said finally. We haven't forgotten what it's like to live without advanced technology because we've only had it for a few generations. We remember how to solve problems using simple tools and basic principles. She gestured around the chamber at the assembled representatives of galactic civilization. You've had quantum technology for 4,000 years. It's not just your tools, it's how you think. When you encounter a problem, your first instinct is to apply more sophisticated technology. Our first instinct is to wonder if we're using technology when we should be using logic. Are you saying that technological advancement made us less capable of problem solving? Dr. Velendra asked, her crystalline form flickering with what might have been offense. I'm saying that every capability you gain is also a dependency you acquire, Sarah replied gently. You've become so good at using quantum technology that you've forgotten how to think without it. Sometimes, that's exactly what you need to solve problems caused by quantum technology. Admiral Zefkar realized that the human had just delivered a profound lesson about the relationship between technological advancement and wisdom. The most advanced civilizations in the galaxy had been stymied by a problem that seemed intractable, only because they couldn't imagine solutions that didn't rely on the same technologies that had created the problem in the first place. The hour Sarah Chen had requested was nearly over, but Admiral Zefkar suspected that the real work was just beginning. 6 months after Sarah Chen's presentation to the Galactic Council, Admiral Zefkar stood in the observation deck of the research station Kepler's Dream, watching something that would have been impossible under the old quantum-dependent infrastructure, a real-time view of space-time healing itself. The massive displays showed the affected regions of the galaxy in unprecedented detail. Where once the quantum cascade had been an expanding wound in the fabric of reality, now there were signs of stabilization and, more remarkably, recovery. The null space bubbles that had consumed entire star systems were beginning to contract, restoring the quantum substrate that enabled faster-than-light travel and communication. The latest measurements confirm it, Dr. Valandra announced, her crystalline form now pulsing with excitement rather than distress. The cascade has not only stopped expanding but is actively reversing. We're seeing quantum field regeneration at a rate 300% faster than our most optimistic projections. Admiral Zefkar nodded, though his attention was focused on the broader implications of what they were witnessing. The implementation of Sarah Chen's proposal had been the largest coordinated effort in galactic history, and somehow it had worked. The first phase had been the most difficult. Convincing 47 different star systems to voluntarily shut down their most advanced technologies had required a combination of diplomacy, economic incentives, and simple fear of the alternative. Some systems had complied immediately, others had required weeks of negotiation, and a few had only agreed when the cascade came close enough to threaten them directly. But as Sarah had predicted, perfect compliance hadn't been necessary. The 83% reduction in quantum activity across the affected regions had been sufficient to halt the cascade's expansion within 2 months. The silence that followed had been eerie, entire sectors of space that had hummed with quantum communication for millennia suddenly going dark, reverting to the slower rhythms of light-speed communication and conventional propulsion. Any word from the deep analysis teams? Admiral Zefkar asked. Fascinating discoveries, Dr. Valandra replied, her excitement evident in the rapid flickering of her crystalline form. Dr. Harrison's team on Terra Station has identified what they're calling quantum fatigue, evidence that our technologies were actually degrading the underlying structure of space-time through accumulated microstress. Admiral Zefkar wasn't surprised. Dr. James Harrison, Sarah Chen's colleague, and one of the human scientists now working with the galactic research teams, had quickly proven to be as insightful as Chen herself, though in different ways. Where Chen was intuitive and strategic, Harrison was methodical and analytical, providing the detailed scientific foundation for human insights. The implications are staggering, Dr. Valandra continued. It appears that quantum-based technologies used at galactic scale for thousands of years were essentially mining the quantum substrate faster than it could naturally regenerate. The cascade wasn't a malfunction, it was an inevitable consequence of unsustainable resource extraction. Like overfishing an ocean, Admiral Zefkar said, repeating an analogy he'd learned from the humans. Precisely. And just as an overfished ocean can recover if given time without exploitation, space-time is healing now that we've reduced the quantum load. And the irony wasn't lost on Admiral Zefkar. The galaxy's most advanced civilizations had been committing ecological destruction on a cosmic scale without realizing it, and it had taken a species barely out of their technological infancy to recognize the pattern. What's the status of the reconstruction efforts? He asked. Ahead of schedule, Dr. Cardo, Valandra replied. The new quantum technologies being developed by the joint human galactic teams are showing remarkable efficiency improvements. Dr. Harrison's quantum sustainability protocols reduce substrate stress by 94% while maintaining 97% of previous performance levels. Admiral Zefkar reviewed the latest reports on his datapad. The shutdown period had indeed become what Sarah Chen had predicted. The largest infrastructure maintenance and upgrade project in galactic history. Systems that had been operating on 4,000-year-old principles were being rebuilt from the ground up, incorporating both advanced galactic technology and surprisingly effective human engineering approaches. The humans had introduced concepts that seemed primitive to galactic thinking but proved remarkably effective: redundancy over efficiency, simplicity over sophistication, resilience over optimization. The new quantum gateways took slightly longer to establish connections, but were virtually immune to cascade failures. The new communication networks had lower bandwidth but could operate indefinitely without degrading the quantum substrate. There's something else, Dr. Valandra said, her form shifting to what Admiral Zefkar recognized as uncertainty. The economic analysis teams have released their preliminary reports on the shutdown period. And the economic disruption was significantly less than projected. In fact, many systems report increased productivity during the shutdown period. Admiral Zefkar raised an eyebrow or performed the equivalent gesture with his exoskeleton. How is that possible? Apparently, the galaxy had become economically dependent on instant gratification enabled by quantum communication and hyperspace travel. When forced to plan for longer communication and travel times, businesses and governments developed more efficient processes and better long-term planning. The humans call it enforced patience, she continued. When you can't get instant results, you're forced to think more carefully about what results you actually want. Admiral Zefkar considered this. He'd observed similar phenomena during military campaigns where communication delays forced field commanders to develop better independent decision-making capabilities. Perhaps there was something to be said for the benefits of technological limitations. What's the timeline for full restoration? He asked. That's complicated, Dr. Valandra replied. We could restore quantum technology to pre-crisis levels within 6 months, but the Joint Council has voted to extend the restoration timeline to maintain current sustainability levels, meaning full restoration will take approximately 2 years, but the new infrastructure will be sustainable indefinitely. No more quantum fatigue, no risk of cascade failures, and continued quantum substrate regeneration. Admiral Zefkar nodded approvingly. It seemed the galactic community had learned something from their crisis beyond just how to fix the immediate problem. Any resistance to the extended timeline? Surprisingly little. Most systems have adapted to the slower pace and are reluctant to give up the benefits they've discovered. The hegemony worlds report that their legislative processes have become significantly more thoughtful, now that representatives can't make instant decisions based on real-time polling data. A chime from his communication device interrupted the conversation. Admiral Zefkar activated the display to see Sarah Chen's image appearing via quantum-enhanced hologram, one of the new sustainable systems that had been approved for limited use during the restoration period. Admiral, she said, smiling from her location on the human homeworld. I hope I'm not interrupting anything important. Not at all, Ambassador. Dr. Valandra was just updating me on the restoration progress. Congratulations seem to be in order. Your solution appears to have worked better than anyone expected. Sarah's expression became more serious. Actually, that's why I'm calling. We need to discuss what happens next. Next? Admiral, the Cascade crisis wasn't unique to your galaxy. Humans have been monitoring quantum signatures from nearby galactic clusters, and we're seeing similar patterns emerging in at least 3 other locations. Admiral Zefkar felt a chill run through his exoskeleton. Are you saying there are other civilizations facing the same crisis? I'm saying there are other civilizations who haven't faced it yet. Their quantum usage patterns suggest they're following the same trajectory that led to your cascade. They're probably centuries away from crisis, but it's coming. Dr. Valandra's crystalline form began flickering rapidly as she processed the implications. We could warn them, share our research, help them avoid the crisis entirely. Exactly, Sarah agreed. But that raises some interesting questions about galactic diplomacy and resource sharing. These are civilizations that have never made contact with your galaxy. Do you have a responsibility to warn them?
Do you have a right to interfere with their development? Admiral Zefkar recognized the complexity of the ethical questions Sarah was raising.
The humans had a talent for identifying not just technical solutions, but the moral implications that followed from those solutions.
What do you recommend? He asked. I recommend that the galactic community establish a crisis prevention council with authority to monitor quantum sustainability across the known universe and provide assistance to civilizations approaching critical thresholds. With human participation? Sarah smiled. Admiral, 6 months ago your greatest minds couldn't solve a problem that a human figured out in an hour. Do you really want to tackle galactic-scale crisis prevention without the species that specializes in simple solutions to complex problems? Admiral Zefkar found himself laughing, a sound that his species rarely made, but that had become more common since extended contact with humans. Ambassador, I think the galactic community would be foolish to attempt anything complex without human involvement at this point. There's one more thing, Sarah added. The Terran government has authorized me to share some additional information about human problem-solving approaches. We've developed what we call crisis anthropology, the study of how civilizations respond to existential threats. We'd like to offer that knowledge to the galactic community. Crisis anthropology, Dr. Valander repeated thoughtfully. The study of crisis response patterns across different species and cultures that could be invaluable for preventing future catastrophes.
That's the idea, Sarah confirmed.
Humans have survived dozens of near-extinction events throughout our history. We've gotten pretty good at recognizing the warning signs and developing adaptive responses. Admiral Zefkar realized that the humans were offering something far more valuable than just their technical insights. They were offering their experience with survival itself, something that the advanced galactic civilizations had rarely needed to develop because their technology had insulated them from most existential threats. I think, he said slowly, that the galactic community needs to reconsider its assumptions about which species are truly advanced.
Sarah Chen's smile returned. Admiral, every species is advanced in different ways.
The key is recognizing when you need a different kind of advancement than the one you've specialized in. As the communication ended, and Admiral Zefkar returned his attention to the displays showing the galaxy healing itself, he reflected on how much had changed in 6 months. The crisis that had threatened to destroy galactic civilization had instead transformed it, forcing them to question fundamental assumptions about technology, progress, and wisdom. The humans had solved in less than an hour a problem that had consumed millions of credits and the galaxy's greatest minds, not through superior intelligence or more advanced technology, but through a different way of thinking about problems entirely. They had reminded an ancient and sophisticated galactic community that sometimes the best solutions were the simplest ones, and that true advancement sometimes meant having the wisdom to step backward before moving forward. As Admiral Zefkar watched the quantum substrate continue its healing process, he wondered what other problems the galaxy might solve if they learned to think like humans. Not because humans were smarter, but because they remembered what it was like to solve problems without relying on the very technologies that had created those problems in the first place. The age of galactic civilization hadn't ended with the quantum cascade crisis. It had evolved, becoming something more resilient, more thoughtful, and more sustainable. And at the center of that evolution was a species that had been considered barely civilized just months before, proving that wisdom and advancement weren't the same thing, and that sometimes the most primitive approach was also the most sophisticated. The galaxy had learned to heal itself by learning to stop making itself sick. It was, Admiral Zefkar thought, a very human solution to a very complex problem, and it had worked perfectly.